companies and a whole spectrum of capabilities and domains and so forth that are using this. So definitely a robust and useful technique, and I hope that this webinar has given you some ideas on how to apply it yourself. That concludes the presentation, and so at this point, as always, we'll have a 30-minute Q&A period for those of you who want to submit questions. There are questions that can be submitted via the webinar Q&A feature here. So let me get the questions up here and see what we've got. Let's see, we had a couple questions or comments saying that people were having difficulty hearing me. I'm afraid that's really not under my control. Hopefully you can all hear me now, but that can be, something can happen on your end in terms of the voice over IP coming down. So so you can occasionally get some kind of weird chipmunking sounds or so forth. So I hope that hasn't been too much of an issue for everybody. Let's see, got a question from Gayatri. How is risk-based testing applied for performance testing? Well, basically, risk-based testing spans all of the different test types, including performance testing, and you would be able to identify risk items related to performance, and then your tests would be focused on those based on the level of risk, as I mentioned before. So really, it's perfectly usable for that type of testing, but it's also really beyond that, because the risk categories include performance, but also go beyond it to look at other things. Now, you could do a risk analysis where you focus just on performance-related risks, and then in that case, you know, it's basically going to determine what you're going to test and how much. But I would really encourage you, unless there's a specific reason why you're just focusing on one risk category, to actually look at the broader range of risk categories. Okay, I got a question from Sarah here. How to apply risk-based testing if we are hand-in-hand with requirements? If we don't have all the requirements defined, how to establish what is more risky or not? Okay, this is a good question, Sarah, and I'm glad that you brought it up. Risk-based testing can use the requirements as an input, as we saw in the case study. But you do not have to have a set of requirements in order to make this work. In fact, we have implemented this for clients where there was not a written requirement specification. In fact, there was no requirement specification at all, and there never was one. And then what happened then is that the experience and shared vision of what the product was to do was present in the stakeholders who are participating in the process, risk-based testing, the risk analysis process. And so that worked perfectly well. Now, I assume that, you know, there is going to be some number of risk items that you might not identify in an underspecified situation, but you'd be surprised at how few new risk items are identified when you go through and look at your risk items against the specifications when you go through that part of the process. Usually it's pretty small incremental amount. So I would encourage you to look at risk-based testing as a strategy that can be applied, especially in underspecified situations. So if that's what you're dealing with, then you know, this is a tool to help you deal with that, because it gives you a test basis in a situation where you otherwise wouldn't have one. And now, if you do have requirements, you might be saying, well, why do I need to do this? Because, you know, if I've got the requirements, I just use the requirements as a test basis. But Notice that the requirements-based testing is a brittle testing strategy in a lot of ways. I mean, if your requirements, where the requirements are wrong, the test will be wrong. Where there are holes in the requirements, you'll have gaps in your testing. The requirements typically cannot tell you how to allocate test effort or how to sequence your tests unless you happen to get very detailed prioritization of requirements. But what we typically see with a lot of our clients is, yeah, the requirements are prioritized, but everything's a priority 1, so that's not particularly useful. The requirements can't tell you how to triage your tests either. So, the addition of risk-based risk analysis and levels of risk and so forth on top of the requirements is very helpful. So basically, if you have the requirements, what you're pursuing is a blended risk-based and requirements-based testing strategy, and we find that works quite well. Let's see, I got a question from C's here. Do you have experience with risk-based testing on a breakdown of functionality? Let's see. Breakdown of functionality. Okay, I assume, C's, what you mean is going by functional areas rather than by risk categories. That is an approach that you sometimes see in certain formalized approaches for risk-based testing when applied to hardware or something like that. If you read Stamatis' book on failure mode and effect analysis, you'll see that's a technique that he talks about. Now that is not something that I would recommend here. You really do want to look across all of the categories and try to identify risks in all of those areas, because otherwise the non-functional testing gets shortchanged, and that's a classic testing worst practice that we blunder into as testers. And so really would encourage you to use that list of risk categories. Now you can tailor that, and you can add and delete and so forth, and that's by all means your prerogative to do. But I would say don't just exclude categories of quality risks other than functionality. It's like, oh, well, we don't have to worry about that, because really we should. Okay, so question came up in an earlier session of this that I want to address, which is how risk-based testing works with the different life cycle models, where it fits in. So if you're following a sequential approach, like was the case of the case study that we looked at, the pilot, what you're going to do is you're going to try to do your risk analysis in parallel with the requirement specification, using a draft of the requirement specification as an input into that process. And then periodically at major milestones, such as approval of the requirement specification and the finalization of the design specification and completion of implementation and unit testing, and after the first, say, 25% of test execution, these periodic intervals, you're going to look at the new information that you've gotten and adjust your risk analysis, add new risk items, adjust likelihood and impact for existing risk items, reprioritize your tests, and so forth. Usually what you find, if change is reasonably well managed on the project, that those are fairly incremental changes.